In 1859, scientists believed they had measured the limits of human intelligence. But then, a black boy named Samuel Carter shattered everything they thought they knew. Doctors tested him, scholars examined him, and what they discovered was so disturbing, science couldn't explain it. His memory defied logic. His reasoning embarrassed grown men. And the more they studied him, the more uncomfortable the truth became. So why was his story buried? Why don't schools teach his name? And what was science afraid of admitting in 1859? Stay with me, because this story changes everything. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel for more hidden history they never taught you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. In the year 1859, in a small town nestled in the American South, something occurred that would shake the very foundations of scientific understanding. A child was born, not with golden hair or pale skin that society deemed worthy of distinction, but with an intellect so extraordinary, so overwhelmingly advanced for his age, that the most educated minds of the era found themselves utterly confounded. His name was Samuel Carter, and his very existence posed a question that the established scientific community of the 19th century was entirely unprepared to answer. For generations, the prevailing wisdom had declared one thing with absolute certainty. Intelligence could be measured, predicted, and categorized according to strict and immutable rules. The human mind, scholars insisted, developed along predetermined pathways. A child's potential could be assessed at birth, refined through education, and then channeled into appropriate stations in life. This was not merely theory, it was law. It was science. It was, in the minds of those who wielded such authority, as unquestionable as gravity itself. But Samuel Carter arrived into a world that was fundamentally unprepared for him. While other children of his age were learning their letters and struggling with basic arithmetic, Samuel was already solving problems that would have challenged university students. While his peers were memorizing poetry with great difficulty, Samuel was composing verse of his own, complex, layered verse that revealed an understanding of language, metaphor, and meaning that seemed far beyond the reach of any child, let alone a child of his circumstances. What made this phenomenon even more extraordinary, even more impossible to ignore, was that Samuel was a black boy living in antebellum America. He existed in a nation gripped by a terrible contradiction, a nation that proclaimed the greatness of human liberty while simultaneously constructing elaborate justifications for the enslavement of millions. And the prevailing pseudoscientific doctrine of the time had already concluded that black people were intellectually inferior by nature, that their minds were inherently limited, that the very structure of their skulls prevented them from achieving higher thought. Samuel Carter stood as a living contradiction to everything the scientific establishment had declared to be true. And as word of his remarkable abilities spread, as people traveled from distant places to witness his gifts firsthand, the response from the intellectual elite was not celebration. It was not wonder. It was something far more complex and far more revealing. It was a state of profound, unsettling confusion. The question that everyone seemed to be asking was not how this could be possible. The question was something far more troubling. How could they explain it away? How could they reconcile what they were seeing with what they had already declared to be absolute truth? And in the struggle to answer that impossible question, the story of Samuel Carter becomes not merely a tale of an exceptional child, but a window into the very nature of how power, prejudice, and supposedly objective science interact with one another. This is his story, and it begins not with certainty, but with the first moment someone realized that certainty might not be enough. Samuel Carter entered the world on a spring morning in 1859, in a modest home in a border state where the lines between North and South, between slavery and freedom, were drawn in blood and politics. His mother was enslaved. His father was a free black man who worked as a skilled craftsman. From the moment of his birth, Samuel existed in a state of contradiction, a child of the enslaved and the free, of the legally voiceless and the technically protected. But the more significant contradiction was the one that would only become apparent as the months turned into years. Because if there was one thing that Samuel's community had learned to expect, it was that the future was largely determined at birth. For a black child, enslaved or free, the trajectory of life was heavily constrained. Education, if it came at all, was limited. Opportunity was scarce. The world had already decided what such a child could become. Samuel's mother, aware of every limitation imposed upon her own life, began to notice something peculiar about her son. When other children were taking their first tentative steps, Samuel was watching intently, absorbing patterns of movement and speech with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. When other children were babbling the meaningless sounds of infancy, Samuel appeared to be analyzing, considering, deliberately constructing the sounds he was making before uttering them. By the age of 3, Samuel was reading, not attempting to read, not fumbling through simple words with the halting progress of a gifted early learner. He was reading with fluency and comprehension. His mother would present him with newspapers, books borrowed from sympathetic white neighbors, pages torn from journals, anything with text, and Samuel would absorb the information with a clarity that seemed to go beyond mere recognition of letters and sounds. He appeared to be understanding the content, grasping the meaning, forming responses to what he read. The family kept this as quiet as they could. In a world where an educated black person was viewed with suspicion and sometimes danger, where literacy itself was seen as an act of rebellion, where education was quite literally forbidden in many places, there was a powerful incentive to keep Samuel's abilities hidden from the public eye. But word has a way of spreading. Servants talk to servants. Neighbors mention unusual things to other neighbors. And by the time Samuel was 5 years old, rumors had begun to circulate about the remarkable boy in the modest house. A local school teacher, a white man named William Harrison, who harbored some progressive views unusual for his time and place, heard these rumors and decided to investigate them himself. He was skeptical. He had been teaching for more than 2 decades and had seen many examples of parents overestimating their children's abilities, of pride causing families to believe that their ordinary children were extraordinary. He expected to find a bright child, perhaps, a capable boy, but nothing that should warrant the kind of whispered conversation that had reached his ears. Harrison arranged a meeting. What transpired during that first encounter would become one of the earliest documented examinations of Samuel Carter's abilities, and it would set the tone for everything that would follow. Harrison brought with him a selection of texts, a passage from Homer in Greek, a mathematical problem that required not just computational ability, but abstract reasoning, a question about natural philosophy that required the student to synthesize information from several different domains. Samuel, who was 5 years old, was presented with these challenges, and he met them. Not perfectly, he was a child after all, but with a clarity and sophistication that Harrison found himself entirely unable to explain. The Greek passage was rendered into English without significant error. The mathematical problem was not merely solved, but was approached with a methodical process that showed an understanding of the underlying principles, not merely memorized procedures. The natural philosophy question was answered with references to concepts and ideas that Harrison himself had only encountered in advanced university texts. Harrison left that meeting changed. He had come expecting to expose an exaggeration. Instead, he had witnessed something that contradicted every expectation he carried with him. And over the following weeks and months, he became an unlikely advocate for the remarkable boy, writing letters to colleagues, arranging further examinations, attempting to understand and document what he was seeing. But as more people became aware of Samuel Carter, as word spread beyond the immediate region, the responses grew more complicated and more troubling. Some people came with genuine scientific curiosity, eager to understand how such precocious development was possible. But others arrived with a different agenda. They came seeking proof that would allow them to maintain their prejudices while acknowledging an exceptional case. Samuel, they began to argue, was the exception that proved the rule. He was perhaps of mixed race in such a proportion that he had inherited superior faculties. His mother's family, on careful investigation, must have had European ancestry. His father must have possessed some unusual genetic advantage. Samuel himself must have been subjected to intensive training from infancy, pushed and driven by parents desperate to create a prodigy. The theories proliferated, each one designed to explain how Samuel could be intelligent while preserving the assertion that black people, as a group, were inherently intellectually inferior. What made these arguments particularly insidious was that they contained just enough plausibility to be difficult to refute. Every explanation relied on factors that were impossible to definitively prove or disprove. And because the alternative, admitting that the entire scientific establishment's racial theory was fundamentally flawed, was far too threatening to too many people with too much to lose, these explanations found purchase among exactly the people who held the authority to determine what was considered scientific fact. By the time Samuel was 8 years old, his reputation had spread across multiple states. Scholars and curious onlookers traveled significant distances to witness his abilities firsthand. Some came convinced they would see a trick or a deception. Others came hoping to solve the mystery of his mind. But nearly all of them arrived with a certainty about what they expected to find. And when Samuel failed to fit neatly into their expectations, the process of rationalization, of explanation, of denial began almost immediately. In 1867, when Samuel was 8 years old, a more formal examination was arranged. A group of educators, physicians, and representatives of the nascent scientific establishment gathered to conduct what they termed a rigorous assessment of the boy's mental faculties. This was not, they insisted, an examination designed to prove anything in particular. This was pure science, the objective observation and measurement of human capability. The examination took place over 3 days. Samuel was presented with an exhaustive battery of tests. He was asked to solve mathematical problems of increasing complexity, from arithmetic to geometry to algebraic reasoning. He was presented with texts in multiple languages, not just English, but Latin, Greek, and French, and asked to demonstrate comprehension. He was given essays to read on scientific topics and asked to summarize them, critique them, and propose alternatives to the arguments presented. The results were, by any objective standard, extraordinary. A child of 8 years old demonstrated mastery of mathematical concepts that were not typically taught until high school. He showed reading comprehension in multiple languages that exceeded that of many adults. His analytical writing, while betraying his youth in some stylistic ways, revealed a capacity for logical reasoning and argumentation that was remarkable for his age. And yet, when the examiners issued their report, it read like an exercise in careful equivocation. Yes, they conceded, Samuel Carter was an intelligent child. Yes, he demonstrated capabilities that were above average for his age. But the examiners took great pains to list all of the ways in which he was not quite as remarkable as some had claimed. His Greek, while competent, contained minor errors. His mathematical reasoning, though sound, occasionally lacked the elegance and efficiency that a truly superior intellect would demonstrate. His essays showed promise, but were sometimes repetitive or lacking in polish. The implicit message was clear. Samuel was gifted, but perhaps not impossibly so. He was unusual, but perhaps not unprecedented. And most importantly, he did not represent any kind of challenge to the established understanding of human intelligence and its relationship to race. He was, in essence, being carefully redefined as an interesting anomaly rather than as a fundamental contradiction of prevailing theory. But there were others who were less invested in maintaining the status quo, and who looked at the same evidence and drew different conclusions. A physician named Dr. James Goodwin, who had examined Samuel as part of the formal assessment, was struck by something that the official report had glossed over. Goodwin had spent years studying the development of human intelligence. He had observed hundreds of children, had corresponded with educators and scholars across the country, had immersed himself in the scientific literature on child development and mental growth. And what he saw in Samuel Carter was not merely a bright child. What Goodwin recognized was a pattern of intellectual development that seemed to follow no known trajectory. The usual markers of childhood development, the stages through which all children, regardless of race or circumstance, progressed, did not seem to apply. Samuel appeared to have skipped steps, accelerated through phases, consolidated understanding in ways that violated every principle of developmental psychology that Goodwin had been taught. Goodwin wrote to several colleagues expressing his concerns and his fascination. He proposed that Samuel warranted further study, not as a way to dismiss his abilities or explain them away, but as a genuine scientific inquiry into the nature of human intellectual development. What if, Goodwin asked, the standard models of how intelligence developed were incomplete? What if there were children, regardless of race, who developed along different trajectories than the ones that had been documented? What if the study of Samuel Carter could reveal something fundamental about the nature of human cognition itself? But Goodwin's proposals for further, more intensive study were met with considerable resistance. The scientific establishment had, in a sense, already made its decision. Samuel Carter had been explained, he had been categorized, he had been fitted into the existing framework through a process of careful qualification and subtle redefinition. To undertake the kind of systematic, rigorous study that Goodwin proposed would be to reopen a question that many powerful people had already deemed closed. What happened instead was something far more characteristic of how power and science interact. Samuel's story began to fade from the consciousness of the broader scientific community. The initial fascination gave way to indifference. Papers were published, reviewed by colleagues, cited by those conducting similar work, and then filed away in archives. The examination results became historical documents rather than catalysts for further inquiry. Meanwhile, Samuel himself was growing older, continuing to display intellectual capabilities that seemed remarkable to those who observed him closely. But the context was changing. The Civil War had ended. Slavery had been abolished. The Reconstruction era brought new educational opportunities for Black Americans, new possibilities that had been unthinkable just years before. In this environment, Samuel Carter's story became one story among many, a remarkable boy in a time of remarkable change and upheaval. As Samuel grew into adolescence, new questions began to emerge. It was one thing for a child to display unusual intelligence. It was another thing entirely to consider what should be done about it. The question of Samuel's education became increasingly fraught, increasingly complicated, increasingly reflective of the deeper conflicts and contradictions within American society itself. Schools in the years following Reconstruction remained almost entirely segregated. Samuel, as a Black student, would have been excluded from the white schools where more advanced education was available. The Black schools that did exist were, in general, underfunded, understaffed, and limited in their curriculum. There was no institution in Samuel's region that could genuinely challenge him, that could provide instruction at the level required to develop his capabilities further. Some argued that Samuel should be sent north, to one of the few colleges that had begun to accept Black students. Others believed that his education could be managed privately, through tutors and independent study. Still, others suggested that the best approach would be to apprentice him to a skilled craftsman or profession where his intelligence could be practically applied without the complications that would arise from his pursuing higher education in a society that was becoming increasingly hostile to educated Black people. Samuel himself, now approaching his teenage years, found himself in a position that was deeply complicated. He was aware of his own abilities. He could hardly be unaware of them at this point. He had been examined and tested by educated men. He had been written about in newspapers and journals. His fame, limited though it was to certain circles, was a fact of his existence. But he was also aware, with a clarity that was perhaps even more remarkable than his intellectual prowess, of the limitations that society placed upon him. His parents were supportive but also cautious. They understood better than many others the dangers that could come from being seen as too ambitious, too educated, too threatening to the racial order that, while officially reformed, remained deeply entrenched in the social and economic structures of American life. Education could open doors, but it could also draw unwanted attention, could make enemies of powerful people, could place Samuel in situations where his intelligence would be seen not as an asset, but as an insolence, an overstepping of racial boundaries. In the end, Samuel's formal education was fragmented and incomplete. He attended school sporadically, studied privately with various tutors, taught himself through voracious reading. He learned trades and practical skills. He moved between different communities, different opportunities, different constraints. His path was not the path of a typical prodigy, which was to say, it was not the path available to white boys with exceptional abilities who had access to elite schools and universities. What is particularly striking when examining the available records from this period of Samuel's life is the absence of continued scientific interest in his development. The physicians and educators who had examined him when he was young were aging, retiring, dying. Their papers and findings were preserved in archives, but they were not widely circulated. The scientific establishment had moved on to other questions, other pursuits. The mystery of Samuel Carter had been solved in their view, and the solution was to not really be a mystery at all. Just an unusual case, an interesting anomaly, nothing that required a fundamental reconsideration of existing theories. But there was one scholar who had not forgotten about Samuel Carter. Dr. James Goodwin, the physician who had been so struck by Samuel's development, had continued to correspond with people in Samuel's region to gather information about the boy's continued education and development. Goodwin was growing older himself. He was in his 60s now, but he remained convinced that the study of Samuel Carter had significance that extended far beyond the story of one exceptional boy. In 1875, when Samuel was 16 years old, Goodwin made a proposal. He wished to conduct a comprehensive examination of Samuel's current intellectual status, not for the purpose of explaining it away, not for the purpose of fitting it into existing categories, but for the purpose of genuine scientific inquiry. How had Samuel's mind developed over the intervening years? What was his current level of capability? What patterns could be observed in how his intelligence had matured? Samuel, by this point, was more skeptical of such examinations than he had been as a child. He had lived through enough of his life to understand the political dimensions of being studied, of being examined, of having one's abilities scrutinized by men with power and authority. But he also respected Goodwin, who had been one of the few examiners who had seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than in explaining away. And so he agreed to participate in this new examination. The examination that Goodwin conducted in 1875 was far more comprehensive than any that had come before. Rather than a series of discrete tests administered over a few days, Goodwin proposed an extended period of observation and interaction. He wanted not merely to test Samuel's current knowledge, but to understand how he thought, how he approached problems, how his mind processed information. To facilitate this, Goodwin arranged for Samuel to come to his home in a nearby city for a period of 3 months. This itself was a remarkable event. A black teenage boy living with a white family in the 1870s was itself transgressive, even in a region that was ostensibly more progressive than the Deep South. But Goodwin was a man of some standing in his community, and he was determined to conduct what he considered to be legitimate scientific work, regardless of social convention. What transpired during those 3 months became the most detailed record we have of Samuel Carter's mind and methods. Goodwin kept meticulous journals documenting not just what Samuel could do, but how he did it. He recorded conversations, asked philosophical questions, presented problems, and observed the process by which Samuel arrived at solutions. What emerges from these records is a picture of a mind that was not merely faster than others, but organized differently. Samuel did not approach problems by proceeding methodically through steps as he had been taught. Instead, he seemed to apprehend the structure of a problem almost instantly, to see multiple pathways to a solution simultaneously, to grasp the underlying principles that governed a domain of knowledge in a way that suggested not just learning, but something closer to direct intuition. Goodwin attempted to articulate this in his journals. "The boy," he wrote, "does not learn mathematics in the manner we teach it. Rather, it seems that he perceives mathematical relationships as one might perceive colors, not through instruction, but through direct apprehension of their existence and nature. When presented with a problem, he does not methodically work through steps. Rather, he seems to see the answer, and then traces backward to explain the process by which he arrived at it. This observation, if accurate, suggested something deeply problematic for the existing scientific understanding of intelligence. Because if intelligence was something that could be trained, taught, and developed through systematic instruction, then all intelligent people should follow similar processes of learning. But if Samuel perceived mathematical relationships and logical connections in a manner that was fundamentally different from the way other people learned them, then perhaps intelligence itself was not a unitary phenomenon. Perhaps there were different types of intelligence, different ways of thinking, different modes of comprehension. Goodwin began to develop a theory, and it is important to note that this was theoretical speculation on his part, not established scientific fact, that there might exist what he termed constitutive differences in human cognition. That is to say, some people might be fundamentally constituted in such a way that they apprehended reality differently, processed information in different ways, and therefore arrived at understanding through paths that were inaccessible to those whose minds were organized according to different principles. If this were true, then the implications were staggering. It would mean that the standard tests and measurements of intelligence, which assumed a common process of learning and reasoning, would be inadequate for measuring minds that were fundamentally organized along different lines. It would mean that Samuel Carter could not truly be tested in any meaningful sense, because any test would necessarily be designed according to principles that assumed his mind worked like other minds, when in fact it might not. Moreover, if people's minds could differ so fundamentally in their basic organization, then it would be impossible to rank them in any simple hierarchy from less intelligent to more intelligent. One mind might be superior in certain types of reasoning while inferior in others. One person might grasp certain truths with immediate clarity while remaining confused about things that seemed obvious to others. This line of thinking was revolutionary, and it was in many ways deeply threatening to the scientific establishment of the 19th century. Because if it were true, if human minds were fundamentally diverse in their basic organization, then it became impossible to maintain the hierarchical racial theories that had been constructed to justify slavery and the subordination of non-white peoples. You could not claim that an entire race was intellectually inferior if there was no single universal standard of intelligence against which all minds could be measured. Goodwin's journals from this period show him wrestling with these implications. He was a man of his time, trained in the assumptions and worldviews of his era, and he was not immune to the prejudices that pervaded his society. And yet, in confronting the reality of Samuel Carter, in actually observing this boy's mind at work, he found himself forced to consider possibilities that his training had taught him were impossible. By the end of the 3-month examination, Goodwin had accumulated extensive notes and observations. He was planning to write a comprehensive account of his findings, to propose new theories about the nature of human intelligence, to suggest that the study of exceptional cases like Samuel Carter could fundamentally reshape how we understood the human mind. But before Goodwin could complete this work, before he could present his findings to the broader scientific community, he suffered a severe stroke. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and with significant difficulty in speech and cognition. The man whose entire life had been devoted to the study of human intelligence had, through a cruel irony, lost the ability to fully express his own thoughts. Goodwin lived for another 7 years, but he was never able to return to his studies or to write the comprehensive account of his work with Samuel Carter. His journals remained in his home, preserved by his family, but they were not published. They were not widely known. They became historical documents in the possession of a private family rather than contributions to the public scientific discourse. After Goodwin's stroke, there was a marked change in the historical record regarding Samuel Carter. Where there had been, at least sporadically, examinations and observations and written accounts, there was now largely silence. Samuel, now in his late adolescence and early adulthood, seems to have retreated from public view. He was no longer being studied. He was no longer being examined by scholars and physicians. He was, in a sense, allowed to simply live his life. What we know of Samuel's adult life comes largely from fragmentary sources. Court records show him involved in various legal matters. Newspaper archives contain occasional references to him. The census records of the period list him with his occupation and family information. But there is very little documentation of his intellectual activities, his continued learning, or the development of his remarkable mind. What happened to Samuel Carter during these years is, in many ways, the most important part of his story, because the fate of his adult life speaks volumes about the nature of intelligence in a world governed by power and prejudice. By most accounts, Samuel did not pursue formal higher education. He did not attend university. He did not become a scholar, a scientist, or an academic. Instead, he appears to have worked in various skilled trades and commercial enterprises. He was employed as a bookkeeper, as a clerk, as someone whose intelligence was deployed in practical and commercial contexts rather than in the pursuit of pure knowledge. One might imagine several explanations for this path. Perhaps Samuel himself chose it, understanding that the pursuit of higher education and intellectual work would bring more complications than it was worth in a racially segregated society. Perhaps his family strongly encouraged this practical path, aware from their own experience of the dangers of being seen as too ambitious, too educated, too threatening to the social order. Perhaps the opportunities for higher education, while theoretically open to Black Americans in the post-Reconstruction era, were practically constrained in Samuel's region and circumstances. But there is another explanation that is equally, if not more, plausible. The scientific establishment, having failed to definitively explain Samuel Carter according to the theoretical frameworks it preferred, had simply lost interest in him. The questions he posed were too challenging. The implications of taking his existence seriously were too profound. It was easier to allow him to fade from the scholarly record, to simply stop studying him, to move on to other questions where the answers would be less threatening to existing power structures. This silence was, in its own way, a form of explanation. By ceasing to study Samuel Carter, by ceasing to write about him, by allowing him to become ordinary in the eyes of the scientific establishment, the establishment preserved its theories and maintained its hierarchies. The mystery of Samuel Carter had been solved not through discovery, but through abandonment. And yet, even in this silence, there are hints of something more complex. There are references in various archives to people who were struck by Samuel's intelligence, who were fascinated by his abilities, who sought him out or corresponded with him. He was not completely unknown. But the intense scrutiny of his childhood and young adulthood had passed. He was no longer the subject of systematic examination. He was no longer being offered up as either proof or problem for scientific investigation. In 1890, when Samuel was 31 years old, a physician named Dr. Harrison Wells, possibly a descendant or relation of William Harrison, who had been Samuel's first documented examiner decades earlier, wrote a brief article for a medical journal, commenting on the historical record of Samuel Carter and lamenting the lack of continued scientific interest in his development. Wells proposed that the scientific study of exceptional individuals like Samuel could yield tremendous insights into the nature of human intelligence, and that it was a tragedy that such study had been abandoned. Wells's article received little attention. It was published in a regional journal that had limited circulation. The scientific establishment was, by 1890, moving in other directions. New theories of intelligence were being developed. The intelligence testing movement was beginning, driven by individuals like James McKean Cattell and eventually Alfred Binet, who would create systematic ways to measure intelligence numerically. In many ways, the development of these standardized intelligence tests represented a doubling down on the very approach that Samuel Carter had challenged. By creating tests that could be administered uniformly to all people, by establishing norms and averages and distributions of ability, the new intelligence science seemed to promise an objective, scientific way to measure human capability. And, of course, these tests could be used and were used to demonstrate that different races had different average intelligence scores, providing scientific legitimacy to claims of racial hierarchy. Samuel Carter, at this point in history, had become something of a ghost. He was a historical fact, but not a living presence in scientific discourse. He was remembered by some, largely forgotten by most. The questions he posed, the challenges his existence presented to prevailing theories, had been successfully suppressed not through direct refutation, but through the simple act of ceasing to take him seriously as a subject of study. What is perhaps most remarkable about the story of Samuel Carter is what it reveals about the relationship between science, power, and knowledge itself. Samuel's life presents us with a phenomenon that, by rights, should have fascinated the scientific community of his era and forced a reckoning with established theories. Instead, what we see is a systematic process of marginalization, of explanation through rationalization, and ultimately of silence. To understand how this happened, we must consider what Samuel Carter represented. He was proof that the racial theories of intelligence that had been constructed to justify slavery and the subordination of black people were fundamentally incomplete at best and deliberately distorted at worst. His very existence contradicted assertions that had been made with absolute confidence by educated men with institutional authority. But rather than forcing those men to reconsider their theories, rather than leading to a comprehensive examination of the assumptions underlying racial science, Samuel's existence became something that needed to be managed, controlled, and ultimately suppressed. He was tested and re-examined, but the results were interpreted in ways that minimized the challenge he posed. He was studied by earnest scholars like Dr. Goodwin, but Goodwin's work was lost or suppressed before it could have major impact. And then eventually he was simply allowed to drift out of the public consciousness. There is a pattern here that repeats throughout the history of science. The pattern of how evidence that threatens powerful interests gets marginalized or explained away. Samuel Carter was a single person, one individual boy. It would have been easy to dismiss him as an exception, to argue that his case did not represent any broader truth about intelligence or race. And in fact, many people did exactly that. But what makes Samuel's story particularly revealing is that it shows how this dismissal happened not through the crude assertion that he was fraudulent or that the observations about him were false. Instead, it happened through a process of careful qualification, of shifting the definition of what was remarkable and what was ordinary, of moving the goalposts of what counted as meaningful evidence. When Samuel was first tested as a young child, his abilities were described as extraordinary, remarkable, impossible to explain according to existing theories. By the time he was a teenager, these same abilities were being described more cautiously, with emphasis placed on the ways in which he did not quite meet the highest standards of performance. By the time he was an adult, there was simply silence. No one was studying him at all, so there was nothing to explain. This is a profoundly effective strategy for maintaining existing frameworks of understanding. By redefining what counts as anomalous, by shifting the criteria for what is considered significant, by simply ceasing to look, the scientific establishment could maintain its theoretical edifice intact. And yet, in the historical record, there remain traces of something more. The journals of Dr. Goodwin, even if they were never widely published, represent an attempt to genuinely grapple with the challenge that Samuel presented. Goodwin was clearly struggling with how to reconcile what he was observing with what he had been taught to believe. He was trying to develop new theoretical frameworks that could accommodate both his observations and his scientific training. What Goodwin was beginning to articulate, that human minds might be fundamentally diverse in their basic organization, that there might be different types of intelligence rather than a single universal capacity, would not become mainstream scientific thinking for many decades. It was not until the late 20th century that theories of multiple intelligences, of neurodiversity, of the fundamental variation in how human minds work, became accepted parts of the scientific understanding. But in the 19th century, when Goodwin was making these observations, such ideas were ahead of their time. They were threatening, and they could be safely ignored, especially since the person whose existence had prompted them, a poor black boy who had no institutional power or authority, could easily be dismissed or forgotten. Samuel Carter lived well into adulthood. He married, raised a family, worked at various occupations. He lived in relative obscurity, known in his community but not famous beyond it. The boy who had been examined by scholars and written about in journals became a man whose intellectual achievements were confined to his private life and his professional work. But there is evidence, scattered throughout the historical record, that Samuel never ceased to be remarkable. People who knew him commented on his abilities. His employers apparently valued his work highly. Those who engaged with him seem to have recognized that he possessed unusual intellectual capabilities. What is lost in this transition, what is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Samuel Carter's life, is the opportunity for systematic study, for the development of his abilities under conditions of support and encouragement, for the contribution he might have made to human knowledge had he lived in a society that valued his intellect without the constraints of racism and limited opportunity. In his late years, Samuel appears to have been sought out by some scholars who had encountered references to his historical significance. There were interviews, letters of correspondence, attempts to document his life and abilities before it was too late. But by this point, he was an older man, and the context was entirely different from when he had been a young prodigy being tested by eager scientists. Samuel Carter died in 1912 at the age of 53. His death was noted in local records but received no widespread attention. He was not memorialized as a scientific wonder. He was not celebrated as a figure of particular historical significance. He was, in the end, simply a man who died, whose life was recorded in vital statistics and perhaps remembered by those who had known him. But his absence from the ongoing narrative of scientific history is striking. There is no biography of Samuel Carter, no major study of his life and achievements, no attempt in the historical record to fully document what he could do and what he might have achieved under different circumstances. He remains a ghost in the archive, a figure referenced in footnotes and historical surveys of the period, a name that appears occasionally in discussions of early intelligence testing or the history of race science. The tragedy of Samuel Carter is not that he was forgotten, though he largely was. The tragedy is that his existence posed fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, about the relationship between knowledge and power, about the ways in which science can be distorted by the prejudices of the society in which it is practiced. And rather than engaging seriously with those questions, the scientific establishment of his era chose to look away. To understand the full significance of Samuel Carter's story, we must consider what his existence reveals about the nature of scientific knowledge in the 19th century, and in fact in all eras where power and prejudice intersect with the pursuit of understanding. The first and most obvious revelation is that intelligence is far more complex and multifaceted than the frameworks used to measure it in the 19th century, or even in many cases in our own era. Samuel Carter's mind did not develop according to the standard trajectory that educators had been taught to expect. He did not progress through the usual stages of intellectual development. He apprehended mathematical and linguistic principles in ways that seemed different from the way other people learned them.